Been working through the book of Hebrews in our care groups, and I hope you've been encouraged by them. As we enter into this next section, we've started the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 7. What we saw there was the definition of faith. Now, the reason why the author is dealing with faith is because he's already talked about in chapter 10 those who fall away to destruction and those who press on in faith unto redemption, unto ultimate salvation in Christ. And so he wants to encourage these Jewish believers not to go back to Judaism, not to turn back to the easy life of Judaism where there was not persecution, and to continue on in the faith, trusting Christ and pursuing righteousness because of who Christ is, the fact that he is better than anything else. And that's why the whole theme of the book of Hebrews is that Jesus is the best. He's better than the Old Testament prophets, he's better than the angels, he's better than Moses, he's better than the Old Testament systems of sacrifice, he's better than any of those things, and he is now the mediator of a better new covenant. And so because that new covenant exists and he is mediating it, we are now entering into that new covenant with Christ, and through our union with him now we have access into the presence of God. The author of Hebrews says, listen, this is much better. This is better for you. And so don't go back to Judaism, because those things are now dead. They're passed away, and now a new thing has come in the new covenant, and this is what you must know. This is what you must believe in order to be saved, and so pursue that reality. And then he goes back to the Old Testament. He says, listen, all these guys lived in faith. They encountered difficulties in their lives, and as they responded in faith, God was faithful to do things with them and for them. And last time we looked at a number of examples of that. Abel, Enoch, Noah, about men who responded in faith to circumstances that they couldn't see, but then they trusted and believed. And by believing, then they had proof of something they couldn't see. And we looked even at Noah last time, and how Noah is this critical example of one who had faith in something that he couldn't see. He couldn't see that rain would come and flood the earth, and yet he builds a giant boat. He must have looked like a crazy man, and yet here he is building a giant boat, trusting. So those are just examples. Now the author of Hebrews moves on to the next example, and maybe perhaps the most important example in the Old Testament, Abraham. And the reason why Abraham is the most important example is because God makes the Abrahamic covenant, which is the beginning of the unilateral covenants of God with people in terms of salvific covenants, where he says, listen, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make your name great, I'm going to prosper you, I'm going to give you the land, I'm going to give you seed and inheritance. And he offers this to Abraham. Now this unilateral covenant that he makes with Abraham, then he calls that the purpose of that unilateral covenant ultimately is to bring the seed, the one who will come, who will bless all the nations of the world. That is the person of Jesus Christ. And so this becomes such a critical point of the Old Testament, and that's where the author of Hebrews spends extensive time on Abraham, proving to us of his faith. Now again, what's interesting about all these examples is that every single one of these examples had tons of failures in their life as well. But the author doesn't deal with the failures. He deals with the moments of faith when God used them in specific and profound ways for the sake of his purposes and his plans in unfolding of history. Now in chapter 11, verse 8, he talks about Abraham, and he says when he was called, he obeyed God by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Now, some of you wives, you think your husbands are like this, right? They go out not knowing where they're going. But that's not a very common thing. We don't generally tend to just leave without knowing where we're going. But Abraham has enough faith in God at that moment for him to go out and trust that wherever it is that he's led, he will be taken and that God will take care of him. And so right out of the gate, we find out that Abraham was a man of faith. And then it says, by faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. So now we have this picture of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob living in tents in the land that was rightfully theirs. They should have had the land. It should have been theirs to keep, to possess, and yet they did not have it, and so they lived as aliens in a land that God had promised them. This is remarkable faith when you think about it. They were already promised the land. If it were any of us, we might be tempted to say, well, let's take it by force, that maybe there's some way we could get this land for ourselves, but they don't do that. Instead of those things, what do? They just wait patiently, living as aliens in tents in a place that is rightfully theirs by the promise of God. None of them actually experienced that life in the land, and yet they trusted God that God would provide. And then he says in verse 10, for he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now this city that he's looking for is Jerusalem. What he's looking for is the heavenly Jerusalem, the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. What else could that possibly be but the city of Jerusalem? God has established and already built a city, the city of Jerusalem. It's the heavenly city. And at some point, that heavenly city will come down and rest on the land of Israel. And the people of God will live together there in the land of Israel, in the heavenly city. This is exactly what the author of Hebrews is pointing to. He's saying they were looking for this coming city. Now, we need to be very careful here. He's not saying they had no thought of physical land or physical blessing in the land. Of course they did. They understood that there was a physical promise to that land, not just the heavenly city. The reality, though, is that they understood that they were not going to receive that in their lifetime, and they were looking forward to a time when, in their resurrection, they would receive that promise that God had made to them. And then we have verse 11, the faith of Sarah. It says, by faith even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. This is a fascinating verse. Sarah actually shows faith. Now, if you remember, when God comes and tells Abraham that Sarah will have a baby, she laughs. If you remember, she doesn't trust God, she laughs. And yet, even though she laughs in that moment, God says, God through the author of Hebrews says she had faith. She trusted that God could do what he said that he was going to do. So even though she doesn't trust in the moment, the reality is that we find out from the author of Hebrews that she did have faith and that she did honestly trust God, that God would provide a child for she and her husband, even though she was as good as dead. She was past her prime. And in verse 12, it says that exact thing. Verse 12, therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Now again, these are great illustrations of the whole principle of Hebrews 11:1, right? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Abraham could not see that a whole nation would be born of him, that there would be that he would have as many children as the stars in the heavens or the sand by the seashore. Not just the nation of Israel, but even his spiritual children that God provides through Christ. There's no way that he could have known those things, that he could have seen those things. It was not going to happen in his lifetime. And yet, he trusted God. He had confidence that it would take place. Why? Because he had evidence of what was not seen. He had proof of what was not seen. He had the conviction of what he could not see with his physical eyes, that those things would take place. Why? Because God had promised, and Abraham was trusting God's promise. In verse 13, he says, all these died in faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. These men died in faith. They didn't ever receive the promises, but they saw them. This is a fascinating statement. Having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance. This is exactly what he's talking about in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. And not only that, they confessed. They confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They said, this isn't our home yet. We're not there yet. The time hasn't come. A time will come. We see the promises. They're out there, but now is not this time. And so they died in faith, not having received the things that God had promised. In verse 14, he says, for those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. They're looking for a future country, a place that they will go, that will be theirs. The land of Israel, the land of Canaan was not theirs yet, but it would be theirs at some point. They're looking for that future country, that promised home that God would provide for them. Verse 15, and indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. Abraham could have gone back. Isaac could have gone back. Jacob could have gone back. All of them could have gone back to Ur. But instead of going back, what do? They always come back to the land of promise. Jacob does go back. He runs away and flees to Laban. And then what does he find? He finds wives, and then he comes back again to the land because they can't go back. They can't stay there. They have to come back to the land of promise. Now, this is very important. God is not specifically saying, no, there's nothing about this land. Israel is just another piece of dirt. It's not that big of a deal. They're just looking for heaven. No, Israel isn't just another piece of dirt. It is the promised land to the nation of Israel. And yet, these men knew that promise would not be fulfilled until the coming future. And so they kept coming back again and back again to the land because that was their homeland in the future. This is fascinating. They live as aliens in their future homeland, waiting for God's promise to be fulfilled. And then in verse 16 it says, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Fascinating statement again. He says they're looking for a heavenly home. And that's not talking about heaven. They're not saying we don't care about the physical land. We're just looking for this heavenly home in heaven. No. What he's saying is God has prepared a city for them. It's already prepared. The heavenly Jerusalem is already there. It's already ready for them. They are eventually going to receive the promises that God made. When God took Abraham up on the mountain and showed him all around the land of Israel, he did, and said, this is all going to be yours. He wasn't just making that up. He wasn't saying this will all be yours, but it's not really here, it's in heaven. No, that's craziness. What he's saying here is that they were waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. And the way that that would be fulfilled is in that future day when Jesus would be on the earth and God would be with them in the city of Jerusalem. And in the city of Jerusalem, they would receive the blessings from God. Now, he continues on with Abraham. This is sort of Abraham part 2, starting in verse 17. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendant shall be called. Now, if you think about this situation, it's incredibly complex. Abraham knows that this is the promise of God to provide descendants for him through Isaac. And then Abraham is told, kill Isaac. So God tells him things that appear to be totally contradictory. You're going to get all your descendants through Isaac, kill Isaac. So what happens in Abraham's heart? He says, it seems that God is putting me in a very difficult situation. What do I need to do? And Abraham's answer is what? Trust God. That's it. And we see what happens in Abraham's mind in verse 19. It says, he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, that God can raise them even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. Now again, he says, God can raise people from the dead. So what he says is, I'm going to obey God no matter what happens, and no matter what happens, even if I kill him, God is able to raise him from the dead. Now, what does it mean that it's as a type? Well, that's an important phrase, right? It's an important phrase. It's not that he's as a type of Christ. That's not what he's talking about. Isaac is not a type of Christ. There's nowhere else in the New Testament that talks about that. Even though it seems like he is, because God provides a sacrifice, that's not the case. And when we try to read Christ back into that text in the Old Testament, we do injustice to the text itself. No, what Abraham is talking about, what the author of Hebrews is talking about here in Abraham's mind is that he receives Isaac back as a type of what? As a type of the fulfillment of God's promises to him. He knew that God would provide a family for him, descendants for him. But how could he have seen that? The only way he could have seen that is through Isaac. And yet he's told for Isaac to kill Isaac so that his seed would be cut off. God intervenes and stops the death, and he sees this as a type, as a picture of what is coming. This future promise is now made real to Abraham as he has walked in faith in that situation. Now, he moves on to Isaac and Jacob. In verse 20, he says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. Isaac looks forward and he blesses Esau and Jacob based on future realities. He promises them blessing in the land that they don't even own. Again, you see this picture of God, of these men walking in faith and providing sight into the future of things that they could never have possibly seen in the physical sense. Jacob as well. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. So what is he doing? He's blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph. They weren't his sons, but he tells Joseph in Genesis chapter 49, he tells Joseph, listen, these sons are now my sons and I'm going to bless them. What is he doing there? He's offering blessing to these men as they go into the land of Canaan. He doesn't know, he has never lived in the land of Canaan and owned it. And yet he knows that God will give them the land of Canaan, no question. Why? Because eventually the blessing will come because God has promised it. And so Jacob leans on his staff and worships God, trusting that God will fulfill the promise that he made all the way back with Abraham at the very beginning. Verse 22, by faith Joseph, in a very similar way, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. Again, fascinating. Joseph has faith that God will provide the land of Canaan to them, no question. And now you got to think about this. This has been many generations now, 4 generations from when the first promise was made, and yet Joseph has confidence that God will absolutely provide based on the promise that he had made to his people. So you have another man who looked forward into the future, trusted that it would take place, and then gives orders concerning his bones that they should be carried out. And if you remember, the children of Israel do just that. Joseph is buried there in the land of Israel. Now again, we have another picture of how these men thought of this. They didn't think of it as just this future heavenly home. They understood this as the actual physical land of Israel. No wonder then that they wanted the bones of Joseph to be carried back into the city, into the country where God would eventually give them the inheritance that he had promised to them. Now, we move through these patriarchs and we come to verse 23, Moses. When he was born, he was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, all parents think their children are beautiful, right? But here, this isn't what it's talking about. It's not talking about beauty, that the child was just beautiful. The text is actually talking about him as a chosen one of God. And when Moses' parents looked at him, because they had faith, they knew that he was the chosen one that would be doing the very things that God had, of bringing the people out of Israel and offering them the land in the future. And so when they saw him, they knew that he was chosen, and so they protected him from the king's rule to kill all of the baby boys. Now again, we have this amazing picture of the faith of these people who look at a child and understand that they must, in that case, disobey in order to protect the child that God had used, that God had promised would come and who would be used to free the nation from the oppression of Egypt. Now, Moses, when he grows up, what happens? By faith, verse 24, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He rejects the comforts of the palace as an adult, and it says, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Now, this is the first picture that we have of Moses and his faith. He says, listen, I want to be with my people. Now, remember, he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. He knew court Egyptian. He knew he had his own room in the palace, right? He was a rich kid, and yet he chooses to go back with the people of Israel in order to protect, in order to seek to lead them, because he knew that God had called him to this mission. He chooses suffering and discomfort instead of the comforts of Egypt and the blessings of Pharaoh's palace. Why? By faith. He's trusting that God has something better for him in following after God in fulfillment of God's promises to the nation of Israel. And then verse 26, he tells us what's going on in his head. It says, considering. Moses, this is Moses' thinking at that moment. Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Fascinating verse. It says that Moses understood that the people of God, that people of Israel would bring about the Messiah. And so the reproaches of the Messiah's people are his. And he says, I would prefer to have the reproaches of the Messiah than to live in the palace, than to have the riches and the treasures of Egypt. I don't need anything that this world can offer me. I prefer reproach for that. Now, if you think for a moment about what's already happened to the people, the Hebrew people who are receiving this sermon at this time, they had been losing their possessions because they were being persecuted. The author of Hebrews here is using Moses as an incredible picture of someone who is willing to let go of their possessions for the sake of following after Christ. What an amazing picture of true faith. Now, Moses, it says, was looking to the reward. What's he looking forward to? He's looking forward to the reward not only of the promised land, but also the reward of the Messiah. He's looking forward to the realities of what God will do with the people when they are taken out of Egypt. And so by faith, he turns away from unrighteousness and seeks to follow after Christ by leading the people out of the land of Egypt. And then, verse 26, we have exactly that. Verse 27, it says, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Now, what's interesting about this verse is that it says he left and he endured the sufferings of the Midianite desert prior to when he came back to actually lead the people out of the land. Now, when it says that he fled Egypt, not fearing the king, this is an important text. When did this happen in Moses' life? Well, if you remember, Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew man, and so he goes out and he kills the Egyptian. And he does this essentially to set the Hebrew free. Well, the next day someone comes to him and says, you're not our leader, right? In other words, they say, you don't have authority to do this with us. And we also know that you killed the Egyptian. And the text in Exodus chapter 2, verse 14 says that Moses fled in fear. Now, here, the author of Hebrews says he didn't fear the wrath of the king. So what was Moses afraid of when he fled Egypt the first time, when he was approximately 40 years old? Moses was afraid of his own pride in seeking to put himself in the position that he knew that God had for him. Moses understood at this point in his life that God's calling on his life was to lead the nation of Israel out of Egypt. But he had taken it into his own hands. He had gone out and killed the Egyptian and then had essentially sought the leadership of the nation prior to the timing of God. When that Hebrew told him, we know that you killed the Egyptian, He was afraid, but he was afraid because he knew he had violated God's plan. And so he left, he fled, knowing that that Pharaoh would put him into danger, would probably kill him for killing the Egyptian, and understanding that he had violated God's commands. He runs away in order to get away from the situation. Now, verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. Now we get back to when he comes back into the land of Egypt, and now he's going to carry the people out, and by faith he keeps the Passover. Now, if you think back to that very first Passover, this is really a crazy thing, right? You have an angel of death that's promised who's going to come kill all the firstborn. And the way you avoid getting killed by the angel of death is painting your door with blood. I mean, of all the crazy list of things to do, why would you ever do that? Well, the answer is that at that point, God had tested Moses' faith. He was seeing what was unseen. He couldn't see the angel of death, but he knew that if God told him to do something, he needed to obey it, to believe that God would do what he said that he was going to do, and then to trust that reality, and then to act upon it. And so by faith, he does what? He keeps the Passover. He leads the nation in faith to keep the Passover and to protect the firstborn of the people of Israel. Finally, verse 29, by faith, they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. This is our last verse for this section. By faith, what does Moses do for the nation of Israel? Now, we know this. The generation that left Israel was not believing. By faith, Moses leads them through the dry land and the Red Sea. He opens the land, and they walk through by faith. By whose faith? By Moses' faith. He is trusting that God will open the Dead Sea and he will lead the nation through. And so he leads the nation in faith. And the nation gets away. Well, what happens to the Egyptians? They come in behind, not believing, obviously. God kills them. And in killing the Egyptians, God proves that Moses' faith is firm and is sure because it's fixed on him. Now again, all of these things are ways that they saw what was unseen, the evidence of things that are not seen, the conviction of what they could not possibly know apart from what God had told them. That's what faith is, taking what we know and then applying it to our hearts. Now, as always, we want to encourage you, take extra time with these things. These are amazing stories. In fact, go back and read the Old Testament stories of each of these characters, and you'll find that they exhibited not only faith, but also moments of doubt. We all struggle with those things, but the author of Hebrews brings this all up and shows us the faith of these men so that we can see what it looks like to follow after God, to see what is not seen, to trust the promises of God, and to turn away from our own wisdom. I hope this is encouraging to you. Take time, read the commentary, answer the questions, enjoy the study. This is an amazing section of Scripture, and we hope that you're blessed and encouraged by it.